Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us for another session of the Why Marx. Tonight we're doing another session of the Communist Culture Club, and we're very pleased to have with us author Ted Reese, who's got quite a fans among our audience, and he was proposed by one of our regular viewers. I'm very glad he did. Bought the book. Do buy the book. I'm not sure actually if that's the right way around. It's called The End of Capitalism, The Thought of Henryk Grossman. Very good read, very well written, easily written, and you'll even get a sort of short version of Capital and a very easily explained version of the labor theory of value. Ted's also written a couple of other books, Socialism or Extinction, and Abundant Material Wealth for All, a draft manifesto for the coming world socialist revolution. Sounds very good. So, Ted, thank you for joining us. He'll be speaking for about 40 minutes, I think, and then we can open up for questions and contributions from the floor.
Thanks very much for having me. So yeah, we're talking today about Henryk Grossman and the final crisis of capitalism, which sounds like a very big claim to be making, but the fact of the matter is that the closer we get to a fully automated system of production, the more likely we are to suffer, that capitalism is to suffer a catastrophic economic breakdown, which therefore entails a political breakdown and social breakdown that it can't recover from. And okay, Grossman doesn't specifically address something like a fully automated system, but we can apply today's conditions to the theory and the sort of prescient out worldview that he had. Henryk Grossman was a Polish Jewish Marxist. He was from quite a well-off family. His father actually owned a mine. But at the age of 15, he got involved in socialist politics. For one thing, he was attracted to subversive politics by the oppression that he saw fellow Jewish people witnessing. He lived in Poland, which was partitioned, and he was opposed to the occupation. And so he got involved in socialist politics as a student, and he was very active, very, very active. And in his own words, he quickly mastered the Marxist literature. He went on to form an independent and lead an independent Jewish party because it was quite clear that the Social Democratic, the Second International, the Marxist Second International, or the Socialist Second International wasn't addressing the needs of Jewish people in terms of the oppression that they were facing. And they were, of course, among Jewish workers, were probably the most discriminated in that region, and the poorest, broadly speaking. So even though he wasn't working class or from a working class family, he certainly identified with the working class Jewish struggle to some extent. And he was fascinated by Marx's writings, and he was a statistician and an economist, and he really took it upon himself to take up Marx's struggle to expose the real character of the capitalist system, because of course there were lots of theorists out there who called themselves Marxist, but in Grossman's view, none of them were upholding Marx's real theory of capitalist crisis, or the fact that, or the theory that capitalism eventually had to run out of road and be replaced by socialism. So, as I say, there were a number of theorists in the Social Democratic Party, which was dominated by reformists, and a number of these had reformist theories of capitalist crisis, which basically amounted to having external factors that created the capitalist crisis rather than something internal to the mode of production itself. So there was the theory of underconsumption. So the theory more or less goes that workers aren't being paid enough to be able to afford to buy the commodities that capitalists need to sell on the scale necessary. And so the system goes into crisis for this reason, which therefore locates the problem at the level of greed or bad politics or economic mismanagement, rather than at rather than locating the problem at the point of production, which I'll come to. There was another theory that was quite similar, that was called the disproportionality theory, which basically argues industry, different parts of the economy in the wrong proportions. And so you get basically lopsided stockpiles and supply chain disruptions and that sort of thing. And so both of these problems can be solved by state regulation. So the system would still be capitalist, but the state would play a bigger role in determining, in taking over from the market, in determining how different industries are subsidized and how capital is allocated to different industries. So both, and of course, so the first one with underconsumption, the state can regulate for wages to be higher. And the second one with disproportionality, that can be solved by allocating capital to different parts of industry, different sectors of the economy in the right proportions. So it had people like Bernstein, Bauer, Otto Bauer, Karl Kautsky, who had originally been a revolutionary Marxist, but ended up as a reformist Marxist. Still believed in socialism, but his theories became reformist. And Kautsky is really the one that Grossman probably attacks the most, because in 1927, Kautsky describes the capitalist system as being healthier than ever, stronger than ever. And of course, this was just before the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. And in 1928, Grossman was at pains to refute this claim by Kautsky, and he wrote his magnum opus, his defense of Marxist Capital, focusing mainly on crisis theory, which is in Capital Volume 3, which there had been a delay to the publication of Volume 3, which Grossman did. That problem Grossman attributed to the sort of misunderstanding of it to some extent anyway. But when Grossman wrote his book, The Law of Accumulation and the Breakdown of the Capitalist System, which he published in 1929, just before the Wall Street crash, in which he predicted that the US stock market was heading for a massive crash. That's the word he used, a massive crash. He said that no one had sort of restated Marx's ideas on crisis theory for 30 years. So there was this big hole in the Marxist literature, which was ultimately a kind of pseudo-Marxism. And the the real content and revolutionary content of Marx's writings had been lost. And although Rosa Luxemburg was writing in a revolutionary sense and shared Marx's view that the capitalist system must break down of its own accord, she didn't really have the right theory either. She had a sort of overproduction theory, which is very similar to disproportionality theory, whereby the number of commodities produced is too many to be consumed by the domestic population, and therefore has to, which is also an underconsumptionist theory. So it's an overproduction theory and an underconsumption theory. And so capital has to be exported to a third nation. And she argued that capitalism would break down because essentially the capital exporting countries would run out of countries, non-capitalist countries, to export to, because of course once they absorbed these exports they would themselves be able to industrialize and become capitalist. So her theory, but that as I say, that's an underconsumptionist view, because and I'll have to come now to the actual theory underlying it all to be able to explain that. So Grossman, like Marx, is arguing that the crisis originates at the point of production, by which we mean that the commodity itself holds the seed of the crisis. So the character of the commodity itself holds the seed of the crisis. That being that the commodity is both a use value on the one hand, it's something you can use for a specific utility, and it's an exchange value. So it contains an exchange value, an amount of exchange value. And that exchange value is essentially production time or labor time. And so the workers go to work, they operate machinery that produces commodities, and the time that they spend working is effectively absorbed by the machines they operate and passes into the commodities they produce, in short. And we know this because the quicker you make commodities, the more commodities you make in the same or less time, the cheaper their cost of that production tends to be. And so, without going into all of the complicated versions of the labour theory of value, that is the gist of it. And this is why we have exchange value. If you could just magic products out of thin air, they wouldn't cost anything because there's no labour involved, and no labour time involved. So, and obviously there's plenty of empirical data now. The likes of Paul Cockshott have produced lots of empirical studies showing that the more labour intensive production is, the higher the rate of profit is, even if the more capital intensive industries produce absolute profits, higher profits in terms of absolute amounts, because they just have a greater capacity to produce. The higher rates of profit are empirically proven to come from the most labour intensive industries and forms of production. But what happens is the more we produce in less time, the more the rate of profit tends to fall. So what happens is that the mass of profits tends to rise. Like I say, the absolute amount of capital tends to rise, and the absolute mass, the amount of profit that is being produced, tends to rise. But it tends to rise with every business cycle, whether you want to say 10 years, for example, like we tend to have recessions roughly every 10 years. Over that time, and from one cycle to the next, usually, not always, but usually, rate of the accumulation of the massive profit, which is essentially the same thing as exchange value. You've got this building up of exchange value that's being produced by workers and contained within the commodities. That tends to slow down. And this results in an economic contraction whereby the mass of profit can actually start to decline because as I say, the more you produce in less time, the more that the less exchange value per commodity on average is the end result of that. It's just a natural outcome. It's quite clear when you just think about it, take a minute to think about it. If we're producing more in less time, it's worth less. The average commodity is worth less. So you get a devaluation of the commodities produced and a subsequent devaluation of the capital owned by capitalists. So to offset this, they have to produce more in less time. And to do that, partially they expand production using the level of technology that they already have, but they also invest in new technology for two reasons: because it can produce commodities quicker than they could before, but that's also driven by not just the sort of need to produce more in less time, but also the need to produce more in less time than your competitor does. Because obviously you also have to sell your commodities, and you want to be able to sell them, you need to be able to sell them quicker than your competitors and before your competitors. So you want to produce commodities that have some sort of competitive advantage, and so that they're better in quality, or they're cheaper. You can sell them cheaper. So the pioneering capitalists, the ones that are producing commodities that are offering something new or something better or something cheaper, that are therefore going to achieve sales at a higher rate than their competitors, they will get a competitive edge and they will corner the market. They will start to take up a bigger share of the market. And this, of course, leads to a tendency towards monopolization, which is another counter tendency. So one counter tendency to the falling rate of profit and the breakdown, the economic contraction, that's all a breakdown is, the economic contraction. One counter to that, so to Grossman, obviously, he doesn't just say there's a breakdown, he says that there are counter tendencies which are countering the breakdown tendency that he identifies. And one of those is monopolization. It not only naturally comes out of competition, because where there's competition, there has to be winners and losers, which means you get, as I say, the cornering of the market or a greater share of the market. There are other benefits to monopolization, which is why we see mergers and acquisitions so much, particularly during an economic crisis, when prices have fallen because of the process of devaluation that's unfolding. You see a lot of an acceleration in mergers and acquisitions, because for one thing, that's a shortcut to expanding the number of commodities that your company owns and produces and the amount of capital that your company owns. So you get companies with a sort of joint shareholding organization, where they're not just owned by one capitalist but several and multiple shareholders, and that increases the capacity to corner the market for a company in a particular sector. And of course, the more mergers and acquisitions take place, the more the monopolization of an industry, and the more that the the market is cornered. That also produces economies of scale, so you can produce more in less time. You can combine investments to innovate quicker, and so on and so forth. There are several other counter tendencies, but these are the main two that I'll focus on for now. Of course, the export of capital is another big one. So because there's only so much labor to exploit domestically, instead of Rosa Luxemburg's theory, where she's saying you need to export capital to find more consumers, it's actually to find more laborers to exploit, to generate more labor time that can be turned into exchange value. That's the real essence of why capital exports are so important for Marx and for Grossman. And this is so Rosa Luxemburg is arguing that there's too much surplus value, by which we mean the amount of exchange value that's produced that isn't spent on wages. So you've got constant capital, which is the value of capital, and you've got surplus value, which is the amount. Sorry, you've got constant capital as the value of capital, and you've got variable capital, which is the value of wages, the outlay on wages. And from empirical data, we know, and Grossman could see it back then, that the outlay on capital tends, but not always, but tends overall to rise faster than the outlay on wages. And this, of course, makes sense because you need to innovate to be able to produce more in less time and to get a competitive advantage over the capitalists you're competing against. So within the labor process, you get surplus value, you get the amount spent on wages, and then the rest of the value is surplus value that is realized as profit when commodities are exchanged or sold. This is then converted in, as I say, it's realized as profit. So it's labor time, surplus value is converted into exchange value and profit. But the more this whole process goes on of accumulation and innovation and the massive profit rising, the more capital is devalued, and therefore the compulsion to expand production yet more and create more exchange value and more profits at an ever greater level and an ever faster rate builds up and builds up. And with every crisis, it intensifies. And this is the main contradiction that Marx and Grossman identify. And what Marx and Grossman do is they produce scientific, or as near to scientific, studies as you can try to study. And this was basically a process that they called successive approximation, which is a general scientific method used across scientific endeavors. And what they do is they abstract from the system. They produce a pure version of capitalism where they basically outline what capitalism does. So there's the workers, the commodity producing workers, and there's a singular capitalist class in this pure version. So there's no competition, there's no foreign trade, and sorry, I was just seeing the questions. There's no competition, no foreign trade, there's no consumers as such, there's no third parties, and there's a constant rate of profit. There's a constant rate of surplus. Sorry, there's not constant. There's a constant rate of surplus value, and a constant rate of capital accumulation. That rate of surplus value therefore needs to to meet. And because empirically it needs to relate empirically to what's true, the rate of constant capital, which is the value of capital, needs to rise faster than the rate of variable capital, which is the outlay on wages. So Grossman is doing this Marx did this, but Grossman's doing it in response to Otto Bauer, an Austrian Marxist, who had tried to prove that capital could accumulate harmoniously and indefinitely, in order to prove that capitalist crisis only arose because of external factors such as political mismanagement or war, i.e., underconsumption or disproportionality. And Bauer produced this study, basically a mathematical pattern listing all of these factors, and it shows that capital is accumulating at 10% and wages are per cycle or year, and variable capital or wages at 5% per cycle. So he follows this through a number of cycles and he publishes it, and he says, look, there's a falling rate of profit, but accumulation of capital is growing absolutely, and the consumption fund for capitalists, which part of the surplus value has to be, or profit has to be allocated towards, that's rising absolutely as well. So he says, look, there's no problem. But Grossman looks at it and he says, well, hang on a minute, you've only done 4 cycles, which is quite amusing because right off the bat, you can see that this is quite intellectually lazy. So all Grossman does is say, let's follow this through. Let's extrapolate Bauer's own table, his own mathematical schema, and see if his conclusions can be upheld over a longer period of time. Grossman finds that in year 35, 36, the system breaks down because by at a certain point, the consumption fund for the capitalist actually disappears, which extinguishes the motivation, the incentive for being a capitalist. The rate of profit falls, continues to fall, and you end up with an amount of capital that can't actually be reinvested because there's not enough surplus value. So again, because relative to the amount, so you've got capital growing at 10% per year, but that can only continue if the 5% per year increase in surplus value is enough to reproduce and expand that amount of capital. So like I say, there's too much capital that can't be reinvested profitably because there's not enough surplus value at a certain point, which disproves Bauer's theory and it disproves Rosa Luxemburg's theory. And it, all the different theorists and all their slightly different theories of underconsumption and disproportionality or overproduction theory, which is the theory that there's too many commodities, and which is basically the same as underconsumption because there's either too many commodities, which is a crisis of overproduction, which therefore means that capital has to be destroyed, commodity capital has to be destroyed or sold at cut rate prices. But this is actually a secondary effect. Marx writes explicitly that overproduction is the same as overaccumulation, or that it's a symptom of the overaccumulation of capital per se. So not commodity capital as a form of capital, but capital per se. which by we primarily mean, money capital and means of production. So there's too much money capital that can't be reinvested, and there's means of production that have to be abandoned and destroyed or devalued. And so Grossman, the one thing Grossman wished to have done a bit differently, because obviously this cycle of 36 years sounds like a very prolonged cycle that doesn't really relate to empirical reality. But the 10% of capital value and the 5% of variable capital is a 2-to-1 ratio, whereas Grossman points out that in the real world the ratio is a lot higher than that. And of course today the ratio is much higher than that, because we're living 100 years later. But obviously he wanted to expose Bauer on Bauer's terms, so he went along with it. But he points out that if we had started with a 6-to-1 ratio or whatever, the breakdown in the schema would have arisen sooner. So the breakdown is inherent to capitalism, and Grossman proves this, and he shows that look, it extends from the existence of exchange value and what happens to it when you produce more commodities in less time. And he explains the driving force behind this whole thing, and ultimately locates the crisis, as I say, the seed of the crisis, the essence of the crisis, in the dual character of the commodity itself, whereas no one else was doing that, which is why they end up coming up with these sort of external factors for capitalist crises, and therefore reformist solutions, which they can be solutions on a temporary basis, but so can devaluation itself, because that produces panic selling during a crisis, during an economic contraction. And therefore that process of devaluation that you get with panic selling enables the crisis to solve itself, because capital that couldn't be purchased before becomes affordable again. So you've got this, there's a great in my videos on my YouTube, I point out a lot this the money market funds in the US as some empirical data that we can point to today to really illustrate this overaccumulation of capital very effectively. You see this the sort of upward trend in the amount of money being stored in money market funds in the US, and it's basically nothing in the 1970s, and then gradually it starts rising, and it gets higher and higher, and it steepens very suddenly before every recession. Particularly noticeable since 2001, when we had the dot-com bubble crash, and then it rises even more sharply before 2008, and then again, and you see it go down a little bit after the recession because of the devaluation, which enables some of that to flow out of the money market funds and back into production. But then it starts to rise again and steepens very quickly again before 2008. And then you can see the same thing happens before 2020. And the same thing is happening again now, and it's been happening for the last few years. And at some point it will peak, and we will have another recession, and that recession will devalue capital to some extent, and some of that capital will therefore flow back out into production. But what happens during the process of devaluation, not only capital and the implements of capital that capitalists need to buy, not only do they get cheaper, but so does the price of labor, because if you're, first of all, you need to lay workers off because you need to re-widen your profit margins. You need to cut costs wherever you can. As a capitalist, you need to cut costs to re-widen profit margins, because if you don't do that, you don't attract investment on the stock market and from other investors and other capitalists who you want to merge with. And by laying people off, you reduce the outlay on wages and create more headroom for investment in innovation. And of course, the devaluation of capital during this period enables an acceleration in innovation. So of course, today we're looking at automation and AI. So in a recession, we're going to see mass layoffs. We've seen it already quite a lot in the tech sector. JP Morgan has announced that it's basically not hiring anyone at the moment. There's all sorts of things going on like this, where you get wage freezes and job freezes. And so when the recession finally hits, obviously we're seeing all sorts of political upheaval at the moment, and the stock market is all over the place. It fell by 20% on the back of Trump's tariff announcements, and it's risen back to the same level for now. But we're definitely entering a period where we're going to see a big stock market crash, because there's this overaccumulation of capital is just undeniable. Again, if you look at the money market funds, it's not going down, it keeps going up. And other examples of overaccumulated capital are, of course, things like investors turning to gold. The price of gold is absolutely flying away at an unprecedented rate at the moment, because investors in a crisis, one of the things they'll do is turn to gold. But of course, Grossman and Marx talk about a final crisis. Marx talks about socialism succeeding capitalism as a natural process, because he identifies the falling rate of profit and this barrier that tends to rise, this barrier of overaccumulated capital that cannot be invested profitably, just can't. So it doesn't come down to greed or bad politics at the essential level of capitalist production and capitalist society. The essence of the crisis and the political manifestations that arise from that are located at the point of production, the dual character of the commodity, the falling rate of profit, and this overaccumulation of capital, which is at the same time this massive profit that is slowing down. In terms of it, the accumulation of it is slowing down and then eventually falling absolutely with devaluation. So these are the things that Marx and Grossman both expose, that the other theorists didn't expose, either because they were just wrong or because they had no interest in seeing the back of capitalism, either because they were from a privileged position or whatever. We can speculate on that. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that Marx and Grossman were right. We can see that empirically today, and there's a lot more. Obviously, we can't just point to a rising amount of overaccumulated capital and say, well, one day this is going to necessitate capitalism being replaced by socialism, because on its own that doesn't prove anything. But the thing that Marx points out about the falling rate of profit that some Marxists don't always point out is that it's not just a falling rate of profit, because, well, is this a cyclical falling rate of profit? no, it's secular and it's progressive. Marx uses the word progressive, the progressive fall in the rate of profit historically. So that the rate of profit tends towards zero. The sort of aggregate rate of profit tends towards zero. There's many studies showing this today from people like Esteban Maeto. I've linked to all of these studies in my book, and you can see summaries of my work on my Medium blog, on my YouTube page, and all that stuff. And so you've got the progressive rate in the fall of profit, and there's other empirical data that we can point to today. So some of the big ones that back up these theories, and they aren't just theories, they are empirical truths as well. But to back them up, we need empirical data, which fortunately we have a lot more of today, of course, with the data and computing revolution. So the big ones are that the number of, and obviously I focus on the US because it's the most advanced capitalist imperialist superpower of the day. It's got the most amount of debt in the world, and debt is a form of over accumulated capital, because debt arises because there's always a lag in the realization of profit relative to when it was produced, of course, but that lag is exacerbated by the diminishing rate of surplus value. So there's an underproduction of surplus value. That is the same thing. An overaccumulation of capital is also an underproduction of surplus value. It's the same, two sides of the same coin. So debt arises because of the underproduction of surplus value. And debt to GDP in the US is higher than ever, higher than at the end of World War II. So this tells us that the overaccumulation of capital is relatively higher, importantly, than ever, not just absolutely higher than ever, which you'd expect because the accumulation of capital is always tending to be absolutely higher. But the very, very striking factors with this tendency towards monopolization to offset the falling rate of profit, to offset the devaluation of capital, we've seen about half of all US banks and all US companies on the stock market disappear since the turn of the century. That's half. That's an enormous number of companies disappearing, either through mergers and acquisitions or through bankruptcies. And often those two things complement each other, because a bankrupt company during a recession can be bought up on the cheap, by the surviving capitalists and surviving corporations. The other thing about the companies on the stock market, the publicly listed companies on the S&P 500, which is the standard bearer that investors look at in the US these days, the average lifespan of the companies on that stock exchange has fallen from around 60 years in the 1960s to about 15 years in the 2010s. So that number might be even lower now, and it will continue to fall, or will continue to tend to fall. So, that would indicate very, very strongly, both of those factors, that the number of companies is falling towards zero, along with the rate of profit falling towards zero, and the average lifespan of capitalist companies also falling towards zero. So this would indicate very, very strongly that Henryk Grossman was right and Karl Marx was right. And I've listed all sorts of other empirical data that also backs this up, but those are the main ones that I think it's best to focus on, because obviously if I list them all, it gets hard to remember, and then you don't remember any of them. So yeah, so just to end on a bit more on Grossman, unfortunately his book was widely rejected by anti-Marxists, of course, but also by the pseudo-Marxists, the reformist wing of the Marxist socialist movement, and unfortunately by the Communist International as well. He was denounced as having an automatic or quietist theory of socialist revolution, which basically ignored the importance of the class struggle. This wasn't true, because in the final chapter of Grossman's book, he draws his conclusions from his theories of breakdown that he discovers in his mathematical schemas. I forgot to mention, he goes from his pure abstractions in his initial outlines, in his initial schemas, and then works back towards a more concretized version of capitalism, a more empirically realistic version of capitalism, by reintroducing the factors that were originally discarded in the original abstraction. So things like landlords, consumers, different rates of accumulation are then tinkered with and reintroduced, played around with, but he always finds the same outcome, because, again, constant capital, the value of capital, tends to rise faster. Whatever you do tends to rise faster than the outlay on wages, because capitalists need to innovate in order to expand capital accumulation, the amount of commodities produced, and to stay ahead or get ahead of their competitors. But yeah, in his last chapter, he says this breakdown generates the class struggle, because it forces the capitalists to attack labor. It forces them to lay people off, to try and reduce wages, to cut public spending, because any public spending that comes out of taxes on capital is going to eat into profits. So if your profit rate is already falling to a point that's pushing you towards bankruptcy, then one of the things you need to do is have less money spent on public services, which is why we see so much austerity today, especially since 2008. A lot of what we hear on the left is that austerity is a political choice, but because profitability falls, capital's dependency on state subsidies rises. So you get corporate tax cuts. They're absolutely essential to retaining the profitability, or at least extending the profitability of capital, because without it, their profit rates are going to be even lower, which then makes it harder for them to attract investors and harder for them to stay viable. And of course, if they don't stay viable, then all of their losers work their jobs, unless we nationalize production and take production under public ownership. So Grossman concludes in his final chapter that the capitalist is forced to attack the working class, or at least most of the working class, in a crisis. Of course, it will play divide and rule. Of course, it will try and privilege some workers perhaps by raising their pay while cutting the pay of the rest of the workers, and all that sort of thing. But in general, the working class comes under attack, their wages come under attack, and at some point this becomes intolerable for the workers, and they have to fight back. And we've seen that. Reese, I know we talk a lot about how working class struggle is not on the same level as we've seen it in the past, whether that was in the 80s or the 30s or whatever. But there has been a lot of working class activity to get wages to keep up with inflation in the last few years. And in the last couple of years, a lot of workers have succeeded in bringing their wages back up to the level to meet the decline in their wages, their real wages, that we saw because of inflation, the wave of inflation after the pandemic and the lockdowns. But of course, they haven't regained the money that they lost during that period when their wages fell behind inflation. So even though the capitalist has lost a bit of ground because wages have risen, they've still gained during that period of inflation. And of course, there's been mergers and acquisitions in that period, as there is with any crisis. And the wave of mergers and acquisitions, to complement the empirical data that I pointed out a minute ago, there's been 7 sort of mass waves of mergers and acquisitions in the history of US capitalism, and 4 of those have happened in the last 35 years. So they're tending to increase the amount of waves. We're getting more waves more often, and they're much happening on a much higher level. You know, the number of merger and acquisitions is greater, and the amount of capital involved is greater. So yeah, these accusations against Grossman were false. He was absolutely clear. He agreed with he cited Lenin. He agreed that there would be no consummation of the crisis without a revolution, without the working class taking up the struggle for socialism. And this is why I think it's so important to balance out which is more important. Like, is the economic side more important than the class struggle side, or is class struggle more important than the economics? Often I would say that more emphasis is put on the class struggle, but I would argue that you need to at least put as much emphasis on the economic situation as Grossman did, because the working class can take up the struggle, but without enough of them understanding that the crisis is inherent to capitalism and can only be solved ultimately without it occurring again to an even worse degree, that capitalism has to be replaced by socialism, which is to say that the means of production, our productive capacity in terms of machines and land, needs to be publicly owned. So we need a socialist state that can usurp the capitalist state and then progressively take more and more of the economy under public ownership. And this is the conclusion that Grossman comes to. He agrees with Marx. He exposes the theorists who try to either correct Marx or expose Marx, or say that Marx hadn't finished his work, and all these excuses. And this was the line that Grossman stuck to in the face of the attacks that he had from reformists and from the Communist International. The Communist International unfortunately rejected his argument and promoted Stalin's chief advisor, Varga, who was a Hungarian communist, had a very similar theory to Rosa Luxemburg, which wasn't the end of the world, perhaps, because at least it was a breakdown theory. but obviously the Communist International's policies were pretty topsy-turvy. The flipping and the flopping between the things like the Popular Front and the United Front, among other things, was perhaps partly related to this inaccurate theory of capitalist crisis. Grossman did get some recognition. He ended up living in Germany, in East Germany, after World War II. He was exiled from Poland. Then he was exiled from Germany by the Nazis, or he fled Nazi Germany. He was in England for a while. He didn't like England. He moved to New York, and then after World War II, when obviously things were getting more oppressive in the US because of the Reds under the bed scare and all that stuff, he moved to East Germany, and he taught his theories in East Germany, and he did get some local recognition, but and his students were fascinated with his work, but he never got the recognition from the central apparatus of the Soviet Union, which I think is a big shame. Obviously, we all have different views on the Soviet Union, but it was a big shame because I think it's led to some of the you can't blame you can't be solely blamed for the fall of the Soviet Union. That would be a bit arrogant to claim, but I think it certainly contributed, because some of the things that the Soviet Union tried to do to accommodate its opposition were obviously unsustainable if you understood the theory, and that meant that the Soviet Union sort of put itself in a position where it conceded more and more ground because it didn't push forward towards global communism. Because ultimately, if socialism doesn't become global, then the counter tendencies that Marx and Grossman identify will fight back. And obviously, a big counter tendency for the crisis of capitalism after the 1970s crisis was to destroy the Soviet Union and re-privatize all of the publicly owned infrastructure and production in the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union started to privatize itself. And then when it collapsed, the rest of it, or a lot of the rest of it, was privatized as well. So this is the importance of Henryk Grossman. It's the importance of reviving Marx. It's the importance of defending Marx, of upholding Marx. I think, I'm not trying to make Grossman into a cult figure or anything, but he's very, very useful in defending Marx, in defending capital, in defending the theory of the crisis of capitalism, in correcting mistakes of communist parties who still uphold overproduction theories rather than overaccumulation theories, and of understanding why the Soviet Union fell, and of everything we've seen happen throughout history, the history of capitalism. So yeah, that's the broad outline of the importance of Henryk Grossman and why we should try to rehabilitate his name along with Marx's.
Very good. Thank you, comrade. Very interesting introduction to somebody. I'm sure I'm not the only one who'd not heard much about him. So that was really interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ted. Comrades, if you have questions or comments, please click raise hand or write speak in the chat, and I can bring you and make you a panelist. I think sort of at the end you dealt with some of the more very common criticisms that were made of Grossman, i.e. that a deterministic view. He was just sit down and wait, sit back and wait. Capitalism was going to just collapse by itself, and all we have to do maybe is push a little. And I don't think he did that. I think Lenin wrote, and I think I read it in one of your things, that he was bending the stick a bit. Grossman was bending the stick,
Yeah.
trying to look at the economic part of making revolution, and why, the tendency of capitalism to um, lead towards a final crisis can help us, can inspire us, rather than presenting it as a, ready-made, it will happen, all we have to do is just wait. And you also mentioned that, he did think of agency, he didn't just ignore the need for the working class to get organized and get involved in the Communist Party, which is something he had done himself his whole life, as you pointed out. So that was interesting. One question I have, though, and that is the sort of the idea, and that's also in your book, the idea that the worse things will get, the more likely workers are to rise up. So once we're really down in the gutter, our wages have been cut, that's when we're most likely to make revolution, which is not necessarily always the case, isn't it? There isn't always a automatic relation there. You can also see, there's countries where people hardly have anything to eat. They're not very revolutionary in those countries, and Marx and Engels, for example, were relatively well off. All these communists, socialists at those times had to have the space to make politics. They had to have a bit of money, not spend their days just working like dogs 10 hours down the mine, but actually had a sort of leisure time to think about this kind of stuff. And I was going to read out something from your book, if you'll allow me. So on page 66, where you're quoting Grossman, who basically he says every major economic struggle necessarily becomes a question of the existence of capitalism, a question of political power. The struggle of the working class over everyday demands is thus bound up with its struggle over its final goal. The final goal for which the working class fights is not an ideal brought into the workers' movement from outside by speculative means, whose realization, independent of the struggles of the present, is reserved for the distant future. It is, on the contrary, as the law of capitalism's breakdown presented here shows, a result of the immediate everyday struggles, and its realization can be accelerated by these struggles. Now, this quote from outside is interesting, because we had Lars T. Lee in a previous session here. And I don't know if you know his work. He looks back at the Social Democratic Party of Germany and what the Bolsheviks sort of learned from them. And he advances the merger formula. He believes that the working class by itself will always fight back against, yes, being attacked, etc. But without, from the outside, being socialism, the idea of socialism, the idea of a system that goes beyond the here and now, something that is entirely different, but is human liberation. Without that idea from outside, the workers by themselves, the economic struggle of working class will not automatically lead workers to draw the conclusion that we need communism, that we need socialism. You can be on the picket line forever and ever and don't come to that realization. Where does Grossman stand on that? So, and it's something that Lenin, I think, also believed, that you have to have this idea further away of socialism, communism, the maximum program as well as the minimum program. Did Grossman, what position did he take on that kind of tension?
Yeah, he's kind of in line with Lenin in that there needs to be a party that leads the struggle and merges the scientific socialism, which is the understanding of the economics, with the class struggle. That doesn't really have to mean that it comes from outside. Obviously, it kind of feels like that in a way because the sort of chief theorists of Marxism have tended to be middle class, and therefore it sort of looks like it's sort of an external factor. But I think, it's about the theorists and the leaders, whether they're middle class or not, they can't do anything without the working class. They can't make a revolution without the working class. You need the mass of a population on your side. And so it's just about marrying the economic theory with the struggle and with the movement. And within any struggle, there's going to be leadership that emerges from within the struggle. And obviously, there's all sorts of people claiming to be the leaders of a movement or emerging as the leaders of a movement. Ultimately, it's about trying to push the majority of a movement in the same direction, or at least a very strong general direction, so that it doesn't, end up splitting off left, right, and centre into different goals, which is obviously a problem. So you have to have that sort of unifying theory and analysis that is therefore unified within one united party. So that is, that's the view Grossman took. And just to touch on another part of what you said, he didn't just believe that capitalism would only be overthrown in a final breakdown. Obviously, he witnessed the Russian Revolution, and we've had other, revolutions that have sort of been the exception to the idea that it would have to be a final breakdown. But from my perspective, I'm living in a time where most, if not all, of the socialist revolutions we've had didn't survive, and we're more or less starting from scratch again. And the fact that we're this far into capitalism, this close to automation, like fully automated production. We've got the empirical data from the US showing that half of the businesses in the US have disappeared. The rate of profit is lower than ever. It's sort of hard to get away from the sort of impression that it is going to take a final crisis where capitalism has really, or more or less a final crisis where capitalism has really exhausted itself, because, of course, until now, it's been able to pay enough workers enough money to prevent them from rebelling. And I agree with you that it's not always when things are at the bottom, things are as bad as things can get, that a revolution becomes possible. But I think at least the process of revolutionary activity can manifest in such periods. But also, it is just the fact that you're right. It is just the fact that wages and living conditions come under attack in general. So what you really need is a crisis where the character of a crisis that we haven't seen before, where the ruling class has to bite off more than it can chew, where it has to attack too many workers to too large a degree than it has the capacity to actually be able to do. So maybe that's the sort of missing piece that we haven't quite identified before, or that we'll see in the future.
And that we have to be organized, of course. I think that is a huge, huge problem, especially on the left in Britain today, which is going into ever smaller circles at the moment. I mean, capitalism is clearly in decline, quite terminal decline, yes. But I mean, Rosa Luxemburg and others have pointed out, it's not just socialism it can go to. There's barbarism is the other option, and that surely is also something that is a possibility in your view. I'm sure as well, as capitalism is, finding it harder and harder to continue. But I was going to ask him on this. I mean, capitalism it has changed quite a lot over the years. The capitalists, not as individuals, but as a class, will try to find ways to hang on, and will try to find ways to tweak things to a lesser or bigger degree. I mean, Keynesianism after World War II was a big tweak to hold off the red thread, etc., but also to hold off the decline of capitalism, and it worked for a bit. Then it stopped working, etc. I mean, there's a thought, and that perhaps coincides with your thoughts on the final crisis, a sort of the climate emergency, the breakdown of the climate, and making it almost impossible for humanity to survive in the long run, which will affect capitalists as well. Of course, they are still people. They will also die, and the idea that there could be an attempt to establish something like a climate socialism of some sort, which is not actually socialism in a way that Marx and Engels talked about it in the Communist Manifesto. It's actually the opposite, but it would, nationalize lots of things, would also prevent strikes, stop strikes, would actually try to run things, plan everything, stop people from consuming too much, i.e. the opposite of the kind of future that we are hoping for, as sort of strictly, almost like a fascist type idea. Do you think, I mean, that a possibility that capitalism could, tweak things to a much larger degree? It has done so far to stop its terminal decline.
I don't think it can do, in my view, I don't think it can do anything to prevent its terminal decline. And everything it does is to be dialectic. Everything the capitalist class does, in some ways, it slows down the crisis and extends the life of capitalism, but at the same time, it does the opposite. All of these things are going on at the same time. The breakdown tendency and the counter tendencies, they're really bound up. They're part of the same piece of elastic, if you like, and that elastic can snap back in the opposite direction, because of course for example, it needs devaluation to cheapen capital to make it affordable to invest again, but then capital becomes cheaper and it devalues and the rate of profit falls and all the rest of it. So obviously, with the climate crisis, it's really difficult to see what they can do, because the worse the sort of the extremity of weather conditions gets, the more destruction of capital there'll be, which means there'll be fewer capitalists. But at the same time, that can create some room. The destruction of capital is a shortcut to devaluing capital, and that can create some room for profitable opportunities. But of course, that will depend on all sorts of other conditions. I just think they're going to carry on doing what they usually do, which is to attack wages, to attack public services, to keep privatizing as much of the economy as possible. Obviously, they're going to get to a point where there's nothing left to privatize, though, and they can frame this all in green terminology and say they're doing it. The Green New Dealers, they talk about privatizing the forests to save them from the mob, because only they can manage them, and keep them up in a way that will keep the planet habitable. But it's just another way of rent seeking, really. Make the public pay to effectively rent out the environment. It's crazy. But yeah, there's just not a lot they're going to do that's any different to before. Okay, they might. Sorry about the noise. They might nationalize some parts of the economy if they have to. If it becomes so unprofitable and the tax base is too weak to subsidize it as a private industry, then they might have, like we've seen in Britain, that they've had to renationalize some of the railway. Then they might do that, but then that tension arises where there'll be part of the ruling class whose profits are too low, their profit rates are too low, and they're looking for ways to to reverse that, and they're going to want to reprivatize those industries. So that tension is never going to go away. So at some point, we're going to have to come to terms with the fact, if you like, that we're going to have to push through all of the way, which means we'll have to convince as many people as possible that socialism is absolutely necessary, no matter how bad it gets. Whether at every point, if we make gains in terms of some nationalizations, we're going to have to say, well, we're not going to be able to just settle for a mixed economy. That won't be possible. We need to push on. We need to keep going all the way. And at the same time, before we get to that point, we have to say that they're going to keep trying to privatize. They're going to keep trying to cut wages. They will turn towards more repressive forms of rule to stay in power and to keep the economy privately owned and all the rest of it. And all the while, they will be chopping down more trees and degrading more soil and burning more fossil fuel. So, yeah. And any attempt to move away from fossil fuel and towards automated renewable energy is, of course, going to backfire, because the more we turn towards automated renewable energy, the less profitable the energy industry is going to become, and also the less need for subsidies, which fossil fuel companies are very reliant on. A sort of, if you can imagine a completed renewable energy system, it's sort of, at that point, it's not so dependent on subsidies because it's renewable. So it doesn't keep renewing the demand for subsidies like fossil fuel does. So these are the problems that capitalism faces, and ultimately I don't think that they can stave it off permanently.
I'm going to have to ask you now quickly before I bring in Peter. This is your idea of a fully automated communism. Sounds very good. I think I've also read about your ideas on the transition period, which we're just discussing. We've discussed it in the last few weeks as well. And there's a debate in the Weekly Worker. I don't know if you've seen it, but what the transition will look like. Can we just nationalize everything the day after the revolution? Can we just go from capitalism to communism, basically, within a very short period of time? Will it take longer to restructure everything? Do we have to nationalize small fish and chip shops, the corner shop, etc., that kind of thing, or will we actually have a period where things are more in flux? But also, I'd be interested to hear about your, fully automatic communism. How long before we get there?
I don't know exactly, but obviously the advanced countries are the closest, which would, in one scenario, makes you think that they are the nearest to socialist revolutions, and that was an idea that Marx had, at least for England. He then decided that Ireland would need to have a revolution to enable, because obviously Ireland was occupied by England and by Britain. He then changed his mind and thought that Ireland would have to have a revolution to force Britain to have a revolution. And then, of course, we saw countries like Russia and China, which were relatively, quite a lot more undeveloped than the countries that didn't have revolutions, such as the US and Western Europe. Obviously, it's impossible to say how close to a fully automated system of production we are exactly, but we've already seen a lot of farming and agriculture industrialized and increasingly automated, which meant that you saw a big decline in agricultural work. We've seen it in manufacturing now. So we've seen this deindustrialization, whereby working class jobs have moved from manufacturing into services and white collar jobs. And of course, now we're entering the period of AI and digitalization, computerization, where those jobs will, the next period, again, I don't know how long it will take, but the next period is going to see those jobs being automated, and there's not really anything left to automate after that. When we talk about full automation, we're moving from labor operated machinery to labor overseeing machinery, as in becoming the watchmen. So you're moving from operating the machinery to supervising the machinery. So it's not that workers won't be needed at all or anything like that, but that you're going to get to a point where you don't really need workers operating the machinery as such. And of course, science has already long sort of usurped manufacturing as the sort of leading edge of innovation and production itself. So yeah, I can't answer exactly how long it's going to take. If we have socialism, it won't take as long, because you won't have to have production based on profit. That barrier will be out the way. There won't be over-accumulated capital. That barrier will move out the way. As long as we remain capitalist, we might actually see a slowdown in the rate of innovation at some point. We've seen a slowdown in the rate of innovation, but we have seen an acceleration in the absolute amount of innovation, of course, particularly over the last 50 years. So yeah, can't say exactly when, and there's no sort of perhaps there's no absolute fully automated production system, but the more people in the future have their own 3D printing, their own robots doing whatever they'll be able to do with them at that point in time, not only will they become less dependent on capitalist enterprise, which will end capitalism, but they'll also become less dependent on state-owned enterprise, which will then see the ownership of production becoming more and more decentralized. So that's the sort of way to think about it. I think it's best to just sort of think about it in generalized terms, rather than sort of trying to predict exactly when we're going to come to this absolute point in time.
We might also have some people wanting to not necessarily go back, but actually do their own stuff locally, don't they? And you grow your own stuff rather than have it all produced in this or that factory, but actually go back to nature a little bit. Okay, thank you, comrade. I'm going to bring in some couple of people with their hands up. If anybody else wants to ask a question, make a comment, please click raise hand, and I'll make you a panelist. Peter, please.
Hi there. Thanks, Ted.
Hi, Peter.
Yeah, hi, mate. I like that. When I was first taking my degree, I took it in economics, and I was a Marxist then, and so I was right into the economic, analysis, and the fundamental kind of Marxism. I used to love that. This thought of we start with production, we build out from there. And we know the system of capitalism from the production outwards. That's the most important thing. How capital accumulates and develops surplus value, extraction, relative and absolute. And the cornerstone of the system is the extraction of surplus value at a rate fast enough to overcome profits fall and all the rest of it. But what I came to understand as well, and I don't know whether you agree with me or not, but I came to understand that Marx was writing capital and the laws as such, as tendencies. And I think that sometimes we can see them as regularities, regularity laws, like in empiricism, the philosophy of empiricism, whereby we begin to understand the world by looking at the regularities and cause and effect. And so I don't know whether you'll agree with me that if it's about tendencies, then we don't always say that they actualize, and that's maybe I'm thinking more and more as I get older, that's because capital takes place within class struggle itself. and it makes it tendential capital, all those categories that you spoke so well of tonight. And that's what makes them tendencies. So there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, but classes get in the way. And I'm thinking about, can we bring in class more here to show that, maybe capitalists, maybe they're more conscious now because of the development of the force of production and, the stuff that you mentioned, the overaccumulation of capital brings in more and more force of production, more and more concentration of socialized production. You have to plan it more, administer it more, more consciousness. And that's on the other side. The other side to that is the working class become more conscious as well. So is part of the law of development, the tendential laws of development of capitalism, also about capitalists thinking, I may not go all out for profit. I may just think about how to control workers too, and maybe that's what Hilferding, in a way, was trying to get at with finance capital when he spoke of not just the ownership and shares of bankers in industry and vice versa, but what happens as a result of that finance capital taking control of production and the pattern and development of production and the contours of production, and whether they're retarding production, not growing it as fast as what they could because of the threat to the working class. So, and I'm thinking how these things might develop internal to those regularities, internal to this accumulation. And I'm also thinking on the back of that, well, can we include all the, the stuff that we say about the drive for profitability, the drive for expanding capital, as you say, and intensifying the rate of surplus value extraction, to such a degree that that the overproduction of capital doesn't lead to a falling rate of profit, as you say. Well, in all that, can we factor in the class struggle? Can we also subsume things like fascism, the rise of the Soviet Union, which took half of the world out of capitalism and the logic of capital, and then social democracy? Can we subsume that within that logic? And I don't always think that we possibly can, because I come back to that notion of it being tendencies again, and the tendencies can move another way, can be thwarted, can develop new potentials, new areas of development, new thoughts by capitalist class of retaining the working class, new thoughts by the working class about manoeuvring capital too. And I think that's gone along in history too. And one of the things, just the last point, is that I think when Marx wrote Capital, he wasn't saying it was capitalism. He was writing capital, not capitalism. And the concretization of capital in the 3 volumes is about the concretization of capital, not getting to capitalism, which is a complex formation with old modes of production still lingering on and still do today. And they impact on those tendential laws. And so while I agree with you that what we get is a lot of clarity as of Grossman, and it's great to see that we can strip to the ideal form of those mechanisms of accumulation, of exploitation. But I'm asking myself, do they really work that way in capitalism with all the class struggle? And I've kind of built my life around the understanding that capitalism's in decline, and it's not just because of a rate of profit. It's in decline because the capitalist class is finding it harder to contain the working class. And that's mean that they've had to think outside the box, not just of the rate of profit, but how to control labour.
Yeah, no, I do tend to agree with you. I'm absolutely in agreement with you that it's about tendencies, but it's all I'm saying is which tendency is stronger ultimately. And in terms of capital sort of becoming the dominant mode of production, I agree. There's still lingering modes of production. Slavery, unfortunately, still exists, probably on an absolute level, perhaps more than ever. But yeah, the tendency is for capitalism's domination of the global economy to increase. And I absolutely agree with you that the class struggle impacts the decisions that capitalists make. Grossman points this out as well, because of course policing the working class and protecting private property costs money. This is one of the reasons that they need a state, not only to mediate agreements between or disagreements between different capitalists and different sections of the ruling class, but to police the working class politically, not just at work, which they can do within their own, within their own companies, but they need to be able to police them on the streets, and they need to be able to protect private property. So any expenditure on public services like the police or the army that are basically exists to expand capital investments, like the army exists partly to expand and defend capital investments overseas. The police domestically exist to primarily to protect private property here, and to stop the working class running riot on the streets. Yeah, these are all expenditures that eat into the rate of profit. So you're right, it's not absolutely everything. Not every not every outcome is determined by what happens at the point of production, certainly. And politics, for these very reasons, has an impact on what happens inside a capitalist enterprise and at the point of production. So yeah, you're absolutely right to point that out. I'm not sure what you meant by subsuming fascism and social democracy. Can you just clarify what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, these come about in the mid 20th century, and they kind of like, although they grew out of capitalism, the contradictions, they weren't just about the rate of profit fall, and they were political, forms that were there to resist, that came out of capitalism, and were there to control workers. And so we
Yeah,
have to, so we can't just kind of reduce it all to the rate of profit fall, and that these forms, which lasted a number of years, decades, which kind of like arrested capitalism quite a lot, and like you look at the welfare state, and just look at social democracy. That wasn't like just working to as a kind of offsetting tendency, counteracting tendency to the rate of profit to fall. And if we accept that, then we have to look at what other laws are operating there, tendencies. Um, or we could just say that, no, these are all about counteracting tendencies. Fascism, counteracting tendency. Social democracy, counteracting tendency. And to me, that is a danger that
yeah,
we don't need to fall into as Marxists, and we want
yeah,
to give some credibility to the working class as well. They're not just
yeah,
a reactive force which gets beaten down by the rate of profit and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. We have to factor them in, not say, yeah, I take account of them, but let's get back to, the rate of profit falling.
yeah.
And, you know,
Yeah, I agree with you. The class struggle is as important as the understanding the economics, because and vice versa. I'm not trying to say the economics are more important than the class struggle, but I think in the past there's been too much emphasis. There's been like, a 70-30 split towards the class struggle sort of thinking. And the problem with that I see is that when you just focus on the class struggle, you end up with a class struggle that settles for social democracy, because you don't get to the point where it's broadly understood broadly enough that this is only going to succeed if we push all the way. Because if we don't push all the way, we're going to get pushed back. So look at the German Revolution. You had the workers' uprising, but it settled for social democracy And that was largely, it really was largely because it wasn't well understood that what they were fighting for wasn't sustainable. You know, the lead, and I'm not really attacking the workers here. I'm attacking the leaders of social democracy who misled the workers into thinking that if you just fight for higher wages, welfare reforms, unemployment insurance, stuff like that, which they did, and they did successfully at great loss, even just for those gains. The idea that that would be enough and that it would prevent the crises that they'd faced in the past from reoccurring, that was misleading. So I think that's why I think it's as important to get as many workers as possible to understand that reforms are not the be all and end all. Because if you settle for social democracy and a mixed economy, at some point the capitalists are going to say, not because of ideology or because capitalists just don't like social democracy or something, they're going to get to the point where they're going to say, right, we have to crush social democracy because it's our profit rates are too low. Too much of the economy has been decommodified or deprivatized, and the only way we're going to get the profit rate back up, reattract investors, so that our companies don't go bankrupt, we're going to have to reprivatize the rest of the economy. So that's why I think it's important to have it in mind as much as the class struggle.
Huh. Thank you.
Is-
Pamela, please.
Just one last point. Okay.
Sorry, Pete, we've got a couple of people still with their hands up. Pamela.
Hi, thank you very much, Ted. I don't know if you've been following the chat. So my question is, first of all, about the relationship between the West and the global South, or the third world, or the ex-colonial world, and the concept of super exploitation of the third world. And some people around historical materialism, and I noticed that Steve Lee is saying that workers in the West are more exploited because of the greater intensity of production, whereas I wouldn't agree with that. Secondly, is it also true that the nature of the global export, the export of capital from the West into the global South, for example, the iPhone production in China, which they're now trying to shift to India, that sort of production is more assembly line type production, a sort of lower level of production, rather than the higher technical production which might be taking place in the West. And thirdly, what occupies me is how we educate a revolutionary cadre. We all know that the left is very split in many ways. I mean, I joined the what was then the Socialist Labour League in 1968, when everything looked as if it was going to happen, it became the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which exploded in a terrible corruption, etc. So I agree with the CPGB, and I distribute the Weekly Worker, but I feel very frustrated that we're not reaching workers with Marxist ideas. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Super exploitation. I agree with you, because the workers in the global South, to use the shorthand, which is obviously a bit of a problematic shorthand, but to use it, they're exploited, and then the value they produce is, a lot of it is then repatriated to the imperialist country through unequal exchange, whereas the workers here, the value stays here. So any value you create and which is then taxed can go towards public services and the NHS, whereas the GDP growth of a global South nation is stymied by the fact that the value created there, some of it is shipped back to the imperialist nation. So the whole nation loses out. So that would be my argument. I agree, though, that the workers in the imperialist nations can actually produce more value in absolute terms because they have the higher forms of technology. So we have better computers and digitalization, which means we can work faster and produce an absolute amount of value quicker. And that might, we don't know and we can't make any assumptions, but again, that might mean that the global social revolution might start in the global north because we have the advanced means of production. But again, I can't say either way. But it is possible, and it's something we need to reconsider because it's probably harder to attack workers who earn more money as they do in the global north. You might get, because part of the theory is of the revolution is that that capitalists can no longer afford the wages of the workers, because there is actually, despite the rate of exploitation rising, the absolute real wage in terms of the consumption of that workers get access to, that also rises. So in some ways, our living conditions have risen despite the fact that the rate of exploitation has risen. So, I can afford to buy this phone or a laptop and a microphone and all these things that workers 100 years ago didn't have access to because we produced them in such great amounts, all the innovation we've had and the devaluation of them because of the expansion of production. In terms of use values, we're richer. Obviously, housing, we're getting poorer for housing and public services. Your second question was about, in China, certainly a lot of their production is about assembling. And a lot of, China's overseas investments are certainly more about raw materials than what China actually produces. But China is moving more towards high-end technological production as well now. It's doing its own AI, its own digitalization, its own apps. It's starting to actually move ahead of the US in a lot of ways in terms of its high-end production. But until recently, it was certainly more low-level and mid-level forms of technology that they were producing, which again means that China's working class is an advanced working class because they've got a lot of very highly skilled engineers now. They're certainly outstripping the US for the number of engineers that they produce. And I have to say that whether we believe China is socialist or not, whether it's socialist, whether it's capitalist, whether it's transitioning towards capitalism intentionally, I'm undecided on those questions. It's something I'm looking at and assessing as time goes on. But it's certainly got a much higher degree of state ownership for its key industries. So the basis of its economy is still state-owned, despite the privatization that it has allowed since the 1980s. And has certainly given it advantage. And it certainly is giving it an advantage now. and they have actually moved towards more state ownership in the last 5 years. So even though they're not fully socialist or anything, that is clearing away some of the over-accumulated capital and the profit necessity, whereas the US is always, in all of its production, is always hindered by the profit necessity and the surplus capital that arises. And your last point, sorry, was about educating the working class. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I share your frustration, absolutely. This is part of why I was motivated to write about Grossman, and just to try and put a little bit more, because obviously the social democratic politicians have a much larger platform than us. There's more of them. They're probably a bit better off. They have, they're in the mainstream parties, or at least some of them are in mainstream parties. So it's difficult to challenge their influence. So when they're going around saying, austerity is a political choice, or the monetary, what is it, modern monetary theory, they're saying we can print our way out of a crisis and all this stuff. It's very difficult for us to challenge and to dislodge that influence. I mean, all I can say is that we have to keep going. And what I've done is I've tried to produce the evidence that is irrefutable, indisputable, so that we can say, look, this is where things are heading. We're heading towards ever greater mergers and monopolization. Yes, this is a general tendency. It might go back the other way for a while, but it won't go back the other way. You can't just break up the monopolies. Like we did, Jimmy Carter broke up the monopolies, or some monopolies. For example, he broke up the airline monopolies, and there were some benefits to that. There was more competition, and so prices fell and made it cheaper for working people to use aeroplanes and travel. So, you've got arguments from parts of the left in the Democratic Party. There's a book out called Abundance, which is again promoting some of these policies. They want to break up fossil fuel, and the Green New Deal, the Green New Dealers, the original Green New Dealers, they want to break up the fossil fuel companies to create room for solar monopolies and that sort of thing. And it might work for a while, but we have to point at the evidence and say, look, this is the stronger tendency. And so what I'm saying is we're actually heading towards a final merger necessarily, because and that means we'll have to have a publicly owned economy, because a total monopoly doesn't need exchange of ownership. There's no exchange of ownership in a total monopoly. It makes money obsolete. So it would have to be socialist. It would have to be publicly owned. So I think these are the arguments we have to get to the core of. And it's certainly not just about pointing out the economics. We certainly have to make emotional appeals. We have to be able to relate to people. We have to build a party that has the backs of people, the backs of working class people. Because if we don't do that, there won't be any trust in us. You have to build trust as well. So it's definitely all of these things. And I would like to see communist parties merging, so that we have more influence. Trotsky and Stalin didn't split until after the revolution. So, if you know what I mean. So I think if we're going to build our influence, we need to start thinking seriously about talking to each other and finding ways to overcome this sectarianism that hinders us, at least to the strongest possible extent. I know it's difficult, and we're never going to merge all the parties absolutely or anything, but we need to get serious, because the crisis is already unfolding. The next crisis is already unfolding. And I think we need to try and put our differences aside. And, if we want to unite a whole working class, a whole country, the whole world, we've got to start uniting ourselves first.
Thank you, especially because we're actually disunited and divided over what is often absolute nonsense and tiny, tiny differences coming back from whenever and wherever differences they arose. Last person from the floor is Ben. Hi. You need to unmute yourself.
Oh, is this working?
Yep, thanks.
Then apologies, I'm operating on a massive sleep deficit, so my technological Ludditism is showing, and not just because I'm currently based in Nottingham. I want to say, first of all, thank you to Ted for a truly excellent talk on a tragically underrated Marxist thinker, and also to the contributions from Peter and Pamela. Pamela especially, I was wondering if anyone has had the chance to read a very interesting article from the website Red Sails on the topic of so-called primitive accumulation and how this is actually a process that is continually at work in contemporary capitalism, either in a search for new markets in the form of internal or external colonization, and in particular as it applies to the disciplining of people who are rendered, as Marx puts it, the surplus population, people who are either like cast out of the wage labor circuit or who are unable to work, such as people that are disabled who face like different very discriminate entries into the workplace, right? Or people who are still laboring at home, like as is very often a case for women all across the world, for a variety of different reasons. Because much like Pamela, one of the things that I've been paying a lot of attention to and keeps me up at night is, of course, the situation in Palestine, and in particular, like Israel's continued genocidal offensive. Because when you were speaking very much about the need to continually or devalue the amount of capital, and in particular to or bring down the cost of labor to ensure like continuing profit rates, I was reminded very much of how increasingly it's become something of a consensus that capital and like capitalism as a system, to the extent we can differentiate them, has to resort increasingly to repressive methods to discipline either the surplus population and the working class more broadly. And there's a book out by a journalist called Anthony Lowenstein, specifically entitled "The Palestine Laboratory." I don't know if anyone's read it, where his thesis is that Gaza is an attempt to render as many of us disposable in as short amount of time as possible, where he argues that techniques of surveillance, population control, like regimentation, etc., will likely be the tools that, or as he puts it, like he tries to split the government, tries to split the political arm of the capitalist state from the capitalist economics, which I think is a major deficit, despite it being a very invaluable book. But the major thing that seems to be at work in his thesis is that as part of ensuring mechanisms of accumulation or methods of accumulation, the situation like we are seeing in Palestine will increasingly take on the form, become more familiar, either in the global south, like to ensure profitability for companies in the global north, or indeed for global north countries to crack down on dissent. And so finally, I wanted to ask if anyone here has had a chance to read through Richard Seymour's really excellent book, in my opinion, Disaster Nationalism, because while he talks about a lot of these processes more at a kind of ideational, we could say ideological level, that he identifies what he calls the sociophobia of contemporary capitalism. Sociophobia meaning as he puts it, any form of like sociality or solidarity or interconnectedness that can be written off as like a non-privatized relation. We might even say that it's the kind of like ideational structures of disaster nationalism that we are seeing is a response to capitalist crisis. And actually, finally, one more thing. Following Slavoj Žižek and ideas about multipolarity, in a recent column about Chinese AI, he says that we should like exploit different divisions within the capitalist world. From like by basically saying we should pit Chinese companies against US companies and vice versa, like big and small companies against each other to hasten the final breakdown. Do you think that there's any fruit in that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting question. Thanks very much, Ben. It's good to put a face to the name. Sorry, did you say about primitive accumulation in relation to surplus labour, or was that separate?
The article in question was called "Really Existing Fascism" from Red Sails, and yes, the primitive accumulation, like the article has it, is an ongoing process within capitalism, so it's a separate thing.
Okay, separate. Okay, yeah, I kind of tend to agree, but I think there's kind of two forms of primitive accumulation, because I think you need to identify the start of capitalism. Obviously, there isn't some fixed point in time when capitalism started. It emerged gradually and had its own failings before it sort of took grip and became globally dominant. But I think it's useful in terms of thinking about the start of capitalism. And then in terms of whether it's ongoing, it's kind of maybe it's not something I've really given too much thought to, but it's certainly the sources are the same in terms of extraction of resources from the land, extraction of labor from the working class, and the conversion of labor into capital. So I think it can be thought of that way as an ongoing process. And of course, capitalism constantly needs to renew itself, as well as being again, to try and be a bit dialectical, as well as being an ongoing historical process. It continually needs to reproduce itself, and it needs to keep doing that in new ways. So you could think of primitive accumulation as being a thing in that sense, certainly, because they have to produce more value. You have to produce the value that was produced in the last cycle, and you have to produce more on top of that to offset the devaluation of that value. So in that sense, you could think of it as primitive accumulation. I haven't read that article, though, so I don't know if that's the same argument that they're making. Obviously, the surplus labour population is a symptom of the surplus capital that can't be profitably reinvested, because if you can't employ the capital, you can't employ the labour that would have been employed if you could have employed the capital. And then as a capitalist, you want to automate as much as you can. And of course, that is held back by the amount of innovation that's been done, the amount of capital that can be produced, the amount that can be invested. So they're held back in terms of the speed of innovation and the speed of automation in that sense. But then when the devaluation and the crisis comes, they can speed up the innovation. Again, obviously, depending on how much capital they have at their disposal and how much of it can be profitably invested. And yeah, I've not read that book, but I've read a review of it kind of being, Palestine being considered a testing ground. Yeah, it's terrifying. Like, there's no getting away from it. It's bad enough what's happening. I mean, it's always been bad enough. Capitalism's always been bad enough. There's been spells where the working class has had a bit more freedom for a while, and then that freedom starts to be curtailed. and it's why ultimately it's why the solution has to be revolutionary and not reformist. Obviously, we want to make it as peaceful as possible, because we don't want to say, oh, we want a socialist revolution, but we're going to have to, we're going to have to sacrifice everyone to achieve it. That's not what we're saying. We're trying to make the world a better place for everyone that lives on this planet. And so we do have to have solutions, but we can't just say, I think if we say, expropriate the whole of the capitalist class with no compensation, then they're going to be even more aggressive than they already are, sort of thing. So I do think our policy should be compensation, expropriation via compensation to the largest possible extent, because obviously weaponry, the level of and destructive capacity of weaponry these days is obviously frightening, not just in terms of how they can use it on a imprisoned population out in the open, but there's obviously the question of nuclear war as well, which would make this whole discussion moot, and we want to avoid that. So I'm afraid that part of the solution is going to be negotiation and compensation, and talking them off the ledge, so to speak. And this is why we need to get, another reason why we need to get serious, and we need to get united, and we need to have priorities of what we're trying to achieve, because we can't do everything in one fell swoop, and we can't have a perfect revolution, can't have a pure revolution. And so we have to take all of these factors into account. The positive side, I think, is that, because everyone has a mobile phone now and everyone has a camera phone, it's getting harder for them to hide their war crimes. I know it's not stopping them, but it is making it harder for them to cover them up compared to in the past. So that is a factor. That is, this is why I think technology is also playing, to some extent, in some ways, not in all ways, because in some ways it's making the system even more oppressive, but in other ways it is also opening up avenues for liberation, such as, social media could very easily be repurposed for democratic purposes, so that for participatory democratic purposes. And as I say, camera phones are making things more difficult for the capitalists to cover up their crimes, and also automation and things like drones. That is actually creating a distributed form of technology. Like I say, we've all got phones. Drones are becoming more accessible. Look at the Houthis. They're making life very difficult for US imperialism, because they can access weapons that are very effective, more sort of unwieldy than the weapons that the capitalists traditionally use, sort of more flexible and a lot cheaper. So they can be poorer. The poorest country in the world can give imperialism a bloody nose. So, this is the other, again, trying to be a little bit dialectical. This is the other side of it.
Thank you very much, comrade. I think the Chartists put it like this: as peacefully as we can, as forcefully as we must. And I think that's the idea when we come to.
Sorry, I missed off a little bit there. The thing about the sociophobia, I mean, that can be just a manifestation of increased scarcity and the fact that there's fewer jobs and there's less capital. So the competition intensifies. So I think that's kind of like a manifestation of that. In terms of pitting Chinese companies against US companies, I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of Chinese companies buying up US companies and British companies, because those companies have nowhere else to turn to, which I find quite interesting. And sometimes China's overseas investments are actually made by their state enterprises. So I don't know about that, but it's very interesting. It's something to look into. Sorry for cutting you off there.
No, sorry. I thought you were finished and you were still summing up.
Yeah,
So
I just looked at my notes and realized I hadn't finished answering.
thank you very much for taking all the comments and questions so seriously as well. So that's very good of you. Thank you, comrade. I think we've learned a lot about Grossman, and perhaps some comrades would like now to study his books and his book, and also yours, which is talking about Grossman. So thank you very much, comrade, and we'll continue next week our sessions on the Soviet Union with Yasmin Martha is looking at popular fronts, cross-caste alliances, and that kind of period. Thanks, Ted. Thank you, comrades, for your engagement. And as you said, nothing happens automatically. We all have to organize. We have to educate ourselves. We have to get together, build a communist party, which is some of us are trying to do at the moment. Why Marx is kind of part of this process. And we're going to continue as well at Communist University this year in central London from July 31st. Thanks very much, comrades. Thank you, Ted. Bye-bye.